Hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to Virtuous Con. I hope that you are having a wonderful time. I'm Leslie Penelope. I write as L Penelope, and I write mostly epic fantasy and paranormal romance. And this is the 5 tips for fantasy world building. Um, a little bit about me. My main fantasy series is the Earthsinger Chronicles. The first book is Song of Blood and Stone, and it was on the list of the Time Magazine top 100 fantasy books of all time. And they also had very nice things to say about my world building. So I do a lot of world building workshops and teaching about this because world building is one of my favorite things to do. It's why I love fantasy so much. And so, yeah, I hope y'all are interested. I'm going to go through the presentation first. And then if you put your questions in the chat, in the QA section, I will get to those afterwards because I can't see both of them at the same time. So let's go ahead and start the presentation. The production, if you will, please switch to that and we can get started. So let's see. My first tip for fantasy world building is to start at the very beginning because it's a very good place to start, which is my Sound of Music reference. I like to start at the beginning, and that could be the beginning of creation, like in second world fantasy, where you have not our world, but a different world, sort of like a Lord of the Rings or something that's taking place in another place. The beginning for me is it can be as early as like the Big Bang, the creation of the universe, what differentiates it from where we live. Or it could be climate, geography. So places to start. Geography was actually where I started for my series for Earthsinger Chronicles. I had these 2 countries that had been at war, and I had to think of, well, why were they at war? Well, geography was a big part of it because they had different climates also. The one was desert land, one was farmland. There was a mountain range that separates them. So the map came into play early on as I was considering the actual story. So understanding, where did life originate? What are the natural resources? How did races evolve and form? If you're doing, they're humans or they're non-humans, whatever the creatures are, how did they come to be? Migration patterns come into that. So I have multiple nations in this world, and they're coming into conflict, but there's migration patterns. Like if all life originated in Africa and everyone came out from there. So in your world, where is that starting, and how does that influence the reasons why people may or may not get along? Origins of magic. Where does it come from? Does the geography or climate or any of these other things affect the magic system? And the creation of myths and legends, natural phenomena, what are they based on? So a lot of early cultures, most of them base their deities, their myths and legends on natural forces that happened with weather, climate. So all of these things sort of work together and build on each other as places to start your world building. And even if you are creating like an urban fantasy, something that's happening in more of a modern time, it doesn't have to be your traditional medieval fantasy. Mine takes place in an alternate 20th century and alternate 1920s-esque era. So I have cars and rifles and things like that. But I still went through this process, even if it's just thinking about it. Like you can go as detailed as you want on any of these tips. So tip number 2. Why is this the only place where your story can take place? So why is this world that you're creating where you're going to put your story? And, a lot of people think of setting as story, and that's especially true in fantasy. So you can't tell, you want to make it so that you can't tell the story in any other place because it has to be so unique. That's part of just the unique value proposition that you're bringing from your imagination, and why people are going to want to pick up your book, maybe instead of, or in addition to other people's books, because it's not necessarily competition. But the world building can be part of the conflict. So can the world itself be a force of antagonism? How do you create that? That starts with the world building. So like example, in the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin, she has a story that can only take place in this world that has been beset by all of these like natural disasters and cataclysms that happen all the time. Her magic system, the orogeny, can only happen in this place because this is where these people developed this ability in response to the climate. In Uprooted by Naomi Novik, there's a malevolent forest that is like the reason why the story happens is because of this magical forest that exists in this world. And so that's why it's the only reason that story could take place there. So how does the world nurture or strengthen the antagonist of the story? If you have, a big bad figure who is the villain, the bad guy, if you think of ways that the world can contribute to that antagonist, why are they the way they are? Is it also because of where they grew up and, these factors? And can the protagonist bend this world to her whim? Is it, whether it's magic or politics or, however your protagonist is becoming a hero and fighting against the forces of antagonism, how does the world affect that? And why is this the only place that can happen? Tip number 3 is, what do people value and cherish? And this goes to the goals and the motivations of the characters. So the 3 very foundational things that you need for a story are for characters to have goals, motivations, and conflict. I wasn't really able to successfully write good stories until I had a good handle on those 3 things. GMC is what we call them. And so when you think about your world and whether, whoever inhabits the world, they're going to hold certain things sacred and dear to them. And oftentimes that's what is motivating your main character, your heroes or protagonists, whether that's family, that goes to culture, customs, religions, rituals, all of the cultural touchstones that create a society are based in what the people value and cherish. So, a lot of our motivations as human beings are pretty generic. Most of us value love, our family and friends. We also value fear. So the things that we fear can be really strong motivating factors for us. And your story is more unique if you view your world, if you view these things through the lens of your world. So if you create characters who have these strong motivations based on what they value and cherish. And understanding the sacred and the profane is really important to creating a world, and then figuring out whether your characters adhere to that or not. So it can be actually interesting if you have a main character who doesn't hold sacred the things that the rest of the society or culture or their family does. And you see that a lot also. Then they're kind of an outcast or an outsider, or maybe the things that the family or society value are negative things, and they're fighting against that. So there's many places where this can go. And you can already see how world building and character and story and plot development go hand in hand. And that's how I approach it too. Like, I generally come up with a premise and, a type of character, and then the world comes, and as I develop the world and I develop the character and the plot, and it's like a braid, and it all kind of comes together in interesting ways. So the 4th tip is, what tears people apart? So it's the opposite of tip 3, where you have what they value and cherish. What tears them apart goes to the conflict, the C in our GMC of goal, motivation, and conflict. And that's basically what stories are. You don't have a story generally if you don't have any conflict. You don't have a genre story, absolutely, if you don't have conflict. So the things to consider here are those values that we talked about in tip 3. How do they come into conflict? How do different groups of people have different kinds of values? And whether they are like dehumanizing each other, or they're just, I want this piece of land, but I want this piece of land. Like, it can be as simple as that. Think about the historical conflicts in the world, and, all of these are building on each other. So if you have thought about the races and how they developed and the migration patterns and where people moved to, where they originally came from, a lot of times when people move to a new place, if there were already people there who came there earlier, they can come in conflict with them. They have different languages and culture and values and all of this stuff. Inequitable resource distribution is another thing that tears people apart. You're sitting on this land, it has gold on it, and someone else wants to come and steal that, and you have a war. You have the basis potentially for your series or your book conflict. And then external influences of things tearing people apart. So maybe you've got 2 groups of people who lived together side by side really peacefully, but, some third party comes in and, tears and pits them against each other and starts tearing them apart. You have that all throughout Africa. And so they were peaceful, but maybe they were already at war. Now they're forced to be together because someone just drew a line on a map. And, these ethnic groups who never really got along shouldn't have to live so close to each other. So you have these external influences who create and stoke conflict that ends up tearing people apart. And then the fifth tip: reveal the world through the eyes of the characters. That is really important. And it goes to this whole braid of world and character and plot. And there's other elements you can braid in there too, but I think those are the main chunks that I like to think about. So when you're looking at the world through the eyes of the character, it helps you, especially in fantasy world building, where there is often the desire to just, a lot of times people have been thinking of this world in their head for years, and they've got lots of notes and notebooks and binders full of things, and they want to tell you all of it at the very beginning, and they're going to go through the whole history of the world. And that's not always the most interesting thing to read about when you're reading. So using point of view, deep POV, which is looking at things through the character's eyes, so that you immerse the reader in the character's experience, and we see the world through them. So we're only seeing small chunks of it as the character sees it, and that helps with avoiding things like info dump and that desire that you have to tell the reader everything that you know about the world. I think they talk about the iceberg method of storytelling, where you only see 10%. Only 10% of what you know as the author shows up on the page. The rest, I think it's important for you to know, but it's not important for the reader to know or have to read through. And sometimes you can get those in other ways. Like I have prequel novellas and, other stories or other media that can help with that. But yeah. And use mainly what you need, but sprinkle in things that have the awesome factor. I think that there's a lot more to world building, obviously. You have to think about things like the economics, the government, their customs, their daily life, the actual magic systems. There's checklists and charts and a lot of different software that can help you world build and pull together all the things that make a society work, and also make your world feel real and lived in and inhabited. But if you always bring it back to the character, and as you are relaying the information to the reader, making sure that it also tells you something about this character whose perspective you're in, unless you're telling it in like omniscient narration or something like that. But each person who views the world can potentially see it differently. So if you have a story that has multiple perspectives, multiple POV characters, and they each see the same thing a little bit differently, then you're telling the reader what they need to know, and you're making the world more full and more vibrant without just dumping out exposition, and while keeping the conflict, there. Especially if two people see the same thing through completely different lenses. That is an excellent ground for conflict. You don't even have to have a traditional villain at that point. You have like Black Panther. You have two people who view the same situation very differently, who react to the same stimulus very differently, or the same ideas or the same historical events very differently, because of a lot of different reasons how they think and their world that they came up in. So yeah, there's just the opportunity to have really interesting stories and do something different and unique because it's coming out from your brain. There's also depth versus width in terms of world building. So when you are able to focus on a character's perspective, then you can potentially go a lot deeper. You can keep things very surface level, but especially fantasy readers, they want to dig deep into the world and they want to really feel like they're living in it. So when you are following a character and everything that they interact with goes to who they are as a character, their characterization and the plot, but also is showing you more about the world in a really deep and grounded way, and immersing them. And I think that's really important. So yeah, there's a lot of other topics, things like art and fashion, media, celebrations, holidays. It could go on and on. And there's plenty of lists and checklists out there in the world that can help you with the actual details. But I think that as an overview, this is kind of how I approach world building and the things that I like to geek out about on it. So, questions. I will try to switch back and see if anyone has any questions about world building. Definitely let me know. Put it in the chat. I could definitely go on about more stuff, but I'm supposed to keep it short and try to address any questions that you guys might have on anything. One question I do get a lot is like, how much of the world do you need to know before you start writing? And that is something that a lot of people, like I said, get caught up on, especially if they have been working on a world for a long time and they know, it's very easy to world build for years and never write. And so it's like, do you want to be a world builder or do you want to be a writer and actually create something that people read? And so my advice there is only know as much as you need to know. So when I start a new project or a new world, like I said, I usually start with a premise, like an idea or a question, or an image in my head, whatever that spark of inspiration is that you get. And then I ask myself questions about it and try to answer those questions and resist the urge to just world build for months and months. With my first book, I had more time, but once you get on deadlines, it becomes difficult. So what came first in your series, character or world, or did they come together? So in Earthsinger Chronicles, the first, I had this premise. I had this kind of image in my head of Jasminda, the main character, on the porch with a shotgun as men were coming to her house. So I had that character in that situation. So that I already knew there's guns in this world. That helped with that. And then I had to figure out, okay, who are these people? Why are they coming towards her? Well, they're enemy soldiers coming towards her, and she's afraid. She has to defend her home. So that the character developed alongside the world, essentially. Like I did have the character first, but I didn't know anything about her except she was a girl alone, with a shotgun. So she wasn't afraid to defend herself, but she was completely alone. And then I had to see, okay, who are these enemies? Why are they enemies? Why are they fighting in the first place? That's when the countries came and the border, the mountains between them came, and then the magical border actually came a lot later that separates them. And so, yeah, I go back and forth. One question leads to the next, which leads to the next. So, the question of why they're fighting came to, one people have magic and one don't, and then they look different and they also hate each other for that. And all of those get kind of rolled in together. And so that I'm really developing everything alongside each other. And sometimes when I answer one question, it'll lead me down a rabbit hole of really interesting things. And then I have to be like, okay, I'm coming back to the story. I'm coming back to the writing and not, I know enough to answer the question. And I've satiated my curiosity about this really cool thing that I found. And now I'm back to asking another question about something else. Someone asks, do you outline and what's your method? I do outline. Yes. I am a plotter as opposed to a pantser, writing by the seat of their pants. And I used to be a pantser. And I tried NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month, several years and failed until I learned how to outline. So my process right now for outlining, a lot of these books behind me are craft books. And there's a couple of different methods that I use. And sometimes some methods are right for certain books and not other books. So often I'll start with Save the Cat. Save the Cat started out as a screenwriting method. And then there's a book called Save the Cat Writes a Novel. And so it's basically 11 points, like beats that a story has to hit. And I'll start with the Save the Cat method of outlining, and see if I can form, if it depends how formed the idea is. There's an even simpler version that only has 7 steps. And sometimes if I'm having trouble with the 11, I will go to a simpler version and just do the 7 steps. And yeah, so I do have to know the end. I have to know sort of the high moments. I'm usually coming into it really interested in some aspect of the story. And so I outline using one of these methods. And sometimes I'll pick up a brand new book and I'll try this one this time. And then I take the outline and I flesh it out into like a synopsis. So I'll write a paragraph for each scene approximately. And my synopses are anywhere from like 7 to 14 pages, depending on the length of the book. And once I have like a more detailed synopsis, then I can start writing. It always changes. So even though I outline, the outline is usually only accurate for the first half of the book. The second half, around the middle, I always realize I've done everything wrong. Like, what was I thinking? I don't know what's happening anymore. And I reread everything and I replot and then I move forward. So just because you have an outline doesn't mean you have to stick to it. It's just like a really good roadmap to have and something that I definitely need before I start writing. What are some tricks to maintain continuity in the mechanics of how the world works? That's a really good question. I maintain a story Bible. So a story Bible is, I use Scrivener to write, just the software, but you can do this by hand, like on paper, although I need to search through it digitally. So I always do it on the computer. So I have a Scrivener file, which I like to use because it lets you have folders and documents inside of folders inside of one thing, as opposed to like Microsoft Word. So I found this template. It's actually on my website if anyone is interested in the Scrivener template, because it's a world building template in addition to being for writing. So it breaks it down. You've got nations and countries and templates for how to fill out the information about them. There's character sheets, there's magic system sheets, there's like culture and technology and all of that. So when I make a decision about something, like, oh, okay, well, this world is 1920, so there's cars and there's, telephones, but Jesminda lives way far out and they just got a telephone, so it's their first time using it. I'll just note, that kind of thing, like the technology, what the level is, the decisions that I make about the economics and every other world building aspect. So I keep it in a file. And I try to review the file like pretty regularly, because as you write, things change. And inevitably, when I'm done with the draft, I have some inaccurate things in my story Bible that I eventually have to go back and update, especially with a longer series. So there's 4 novels and 3 novellas in my series. And it takes place, the last novella takes place 500 years before the main books. So there's a lot that I have to know. I have like an overview of all of the wars of the 500 years, and that's in the story Bible. So yeah, having a way an organized way to keep it together and that I can search through and figure out, okay, what did I say about the magic system in book 1 when I'm writing book 3? That's why it's important to try to, after the book is written, to update and revise it so that it's accurate, so that I know. There are other ways. You can have like another person do it for you. You can pay people to do it, but obviously I think it's better to have it yourself because you know the story the best. So yeah, I try to keep really good notes. Can you speak to creating characters? Like, how do you create a fleshed out person? Characters, I think it's about the arcs. So most characters are going to change. Most main characters are going to change. There are characters who don't change over the course of the story, like a Sherlock Holmes or James Bond or someone like that. But usually your hero is going to have a positive change arc, and the villain can often have a negative change arc, or like someone, a protagonist in like The Godfather has a negative change arc too. So even their minor characters should have some kind of change that they're going through over the course of the story. And I think that is one of the ways to create a fleshed out person, is to understand that they're starting at the story with something is already kind of wrong in their life usually. I call it the problem before the problem. So if the plot of the book is about, awakening a sleeping goddess to stop this war, the thing that happens before our main character even goes on that journey is she's an orphan alone in a country that hates her. This is the thing before the thing. And on top of that, she owes a bunch of taxes. So like having characters in conflict that is not necessarily only the main conflict with the villain, but setting up smaller, either interpersonal or internal conflicts that the character is dealing with. And then over the course of the book, or maybe even the series, they're dealing with their personal demons and they are learning and growing and changing. And sometimes it's for the good and sometimes it's for the bad. And sometimes it's both. They go up and down. And even if they end up at the very end in a high place, you can take them a lot of places. So that's how people end up feeling three-dimensional, is when they're going through things and they're reacting to things in their world based on their own personal histories and backstories. And so even for a relatively minor character, if they have a name and they have screen time, I know at least a little about their inner journey. And even if they only have a few lines on the page, hopefully that comes through, and especially with your main characters. So knowing as much as you can about like what has hurt them in the past, what their wound is, and what they're bringing to a situation. You know, like people that you meet in the world, some people are going to come at you real crazy because they're obviously dealing with something that terrible that's happened to them, and it's not about you, it's about them. Or even if they're masking, you know, that they're really sweet and nice and kind, but they're masking like a deep well of pain. Like everybody's dealing with something. And so all of your characters are dealing with something too. How do you balance the POVs of multiple characters? Yeah, that can be difficult because the first version of Song of Blood and Stone, I think it only had the 2 POV characters and then some flashbacks. And then by the special edition, I had brought in some other POVs. And the 4th book, which comes out in August, has 5 or 6. I lost track of how many POVs it has. So he's really balancing the character arcs and the plot arcs. That's how I think of it. Like it's another thing that gets braided and weaved together. I know each individual story, like plot arc or subplot. So in a book like book 3, Cry of Metal and Bone, where you're following, I think you start with Ty, there's Vet, there's just, there's 4 or 5 characters, I think, in that book, and then a couple of little extras. And I know I outline each of the story arcs independently. And then I also have an outline for like the main story arc. And then balancing, some of it is just energy. It's kind of like intuition. Like as I'm writing, I want to go back and forth so people don't forget, hopefully, you know, the person who was three subplots ago or 3 POVs ago. And then also balancing it for, are we up? Are we down? Like there's a technique in a book called The Story Grid by Sean Coyne, where when you revise a novel, you take each scene and you see what the shift of polarity is, which is like, is it starting at a negative to a positive or positive to a negative, or it can go negative to more negative or positive to more positive. And every scene shouldn't be the same. Like it shouldn't be, she starts down and then has a wind, starts down, up, because that is odd pacing. So when you're mixing in the characters and plot lines and the POVs, you're also trying to make sure that like the reader experience is taking them emotionally like up and down and up and down, and so and coming and going from different places. And that's something that's in revision. Like I wouldn't recommend trying to think about that on a first draft. But if you look at something and you're working on a story with multiple POVs, then yeah, thinking about, are we ending like with a win or a loss emotionally on this character? And then how are we starting the next character? Where are they? And if it's too close, can I push that? Can I switch it? Or can I come into that scene in a slightly different place so that the emotional journey of the reader is respected in some way? Sometimes it's just chronological and you just have to tell the story the way that it gets told. But I'll stop showing this because that. But yeah, that's how I do with the POVs. In Song of Blood and Stone, there's a scene in the post office. If you remember, could you relay how that was built as an example of these world building points? Yes, I'll have to look at it. I do kind of remember, because the post office scene was always, it was always a version of it there. It did change from the beginning. All right, so it's like the very first chapter. I knew that I wanted to show, you know, starting a book with the main character, you want to make the reader care about the character and like empathize with them a little bit, or at least know where they're coming from. You're introducing the world, you're introducing everything. So there's a lot of weight that has to happen in the first chapter. It balances a lot and it has to do a lot of things. So I needed to show Jasminda, give you an understanding of like her gender, her race, her age, a little bit of what she looks like, and a little bit of her backstory, like what she's been going through. What is the problem before the problem? Because, you know, the real problem, well, it starts when she meets Jack and then it continues when the people come to her home. So I start out with, like, in her perspective, I also wanted to introduce the magic, you know, that Earthsong exists. She has Earthsong. What can Earthsong do? So we show really early on an example of what it can do while we're showing that the first thing she does basically is change the skin color of her arm. It's kind of to mess with the people in the post office, I think, to show, the prejudice that she's dealing with, that it's partially magic, partially based on skin color, that she has this power, and that she is judged for it. Also showing her situation that she's alone. So she's coming to this town. She goes to the post office to pick up her packages, and she gets a letter. That's where I introduced the telephone that's in the post office, and she doesn't know how to use it. So I'm introducing technology there as part of the world, and the money, the system of economics a little bit. Like, what's the money called? We introduce that too. And all the while you're in, like, emotionally, she's going through this. She doesn't want to be going through this. She has this phone call because she's gotten this letter that she owes money on the taxes, and she has to call the lawyer, essentially far away. So we also learn that she's in like a remote rural town, and the capital is far away, and it costs, however much it costs to call on this new telephone. You learn about her family situation because, her father and her brothers are gone. Her mother died a while ago. And then once she leaves that post office, it's like page 9, right? But you've learned a lot about the world and the magic. You at least been introduced. Your appetite has been whet, hopefully, if I did my job right. Your appetite has been whet to keep turning the pages. And you got some of her personality too. Like, she's a little like prickly. Like, when the ladies come in and look at her, she's going to try to shock them with her magic, which is that first thing she does by changing the color of her skin on her arm. And she's angry. She's got a lot of pent up anger and bitterness about the way that she's treated. And then you kind of, so another example, the next scene, she leaves and she goes into the blacksmith's, where she has like a more friendly interaction, but she's still a little wary. So the blacksmith is kind to her. You see that people, some people are different. Everyone's not the same in this world, but overall, she has this reaction against her skin color and her magic. And she has a good interaction with this person. So showing different types of people in the world and different attitudes, I think, is always important, especially when you're dealing with racism. So it's not like completely oppressive, but it's also a little bit more realistic. Like, she doesn't completely trust the blacksmith, but he is kinder to her. And you get a little bit of more of the magic, and then the backstory of her family. And, then it ends kind of with, that scene ends with a surprise. And I think that's when she meets Jack at the end, and she walks. Oh, she has an interaction with the constable, which is a third person. So that she directly interacts with the second person, who is basically very racist to her. I want it to be more of a paternalistic microaggression situation in that interaction, just to see the various different ways that Elsirans treat her. And plot is revealed in terms of, he knows about the taxes, that she's going to lose her house. So we're like raising the stakes there. Like, not only did she have this phone call, she is dealing with the constable who's going to kick her out of her house if she doesn't pay the taxes. So yeah, that's a really good question, to show how, especially early on, introducing all of these different concepts. Like, there's so much that I had to do there. And I think at the beginning of a fantasy novel, I also didn't want to do the thing that I see a lot, where, when you open a fantasy novel, you have to read the first couple pages 3 or 4 times, because you're just assaulted with proper nouns. There's names and countries and places and systems, and you're like, whoa. That is something that I think fantasy readers can expect, but I was also hoping to bring in people who are going to shut the book if they encounter that, and hopefully get them to keep reading. So I was trying to ease people into the world building and reveal it. She thinks about her magic as she does it. She's not starting out the book with just like a recitation of everything our song can do and all of her powers. She's showing you in the scene, in real time, as a reaction to something coming at her, what this magic can do. And so that's kind of an example of, like, number 5, showing it through the character's eyes and perspective. There's a lot more that you learn from her and from other characters throughout this, like, 500-page book or whatever. But you don't have to front load it. You can just give it to people as they need it, and as the characters think about it, and as the characters need it, in addition to when the reader needs it. Any more questions? Those are really good questions, you guys. I was going to say something I forgot. Oh, if you're doing like contemporary, you might not be doing a complete second world. So if you're doing a more contemporary story that even happens in our world, but like an urban fantasy or contemporary fantasy where maybe it started out in our world, but there's something that's a little bit different. Still think about all of these things, but obviously you won't have to spend as much time on them. But whatever that thing is that diverge, like an alternate history, that can, go through all the same world building steps. What are some of the things you struggle with when world building? Decisions sometimes, and writing myself into a corner, which can happen. The thing I'm writing right now, I'm working on a futuristic alternate world, like an alternate version of San Francisco, and people shift into animals because they have a daemon, like a spirit that they connect with, and then that gives them powers. So I'm writing along, and I had made these rules for the world and the magic, and it was like, people also have 3 souls in this world. And, if you lose, the rule I had written was like, if you lose 2 of your souls, like you can lose 2 and still live, but if you lose 3 souls, then you die. And also, you can't, if people can steal one of your souls in this world. So if someone steals your soul, they can keep it, but you can't get too far away from it. I know this sounds like a lot. I'm sorry, I'm being confusing. But like, I wrote myself into a huge plot hole because I had already had this character who was missing a soul. And I was like, but they don't know where it is. So by my own logic, if she's far away from her soul, she would get weak and eventually die. And I had just written the 2 chapters and I'm like, I have to change everything. How did I not think about that first? Like, that is a huge plot hole. That is a problem. So as opposed to actually rewriting everything, I was like, well, what is an exception I can make? Or is there another rule I can layer on top of this that doesn't seem forced, that actually makes sense in the world, and that will allow me to have this discrepancy that I just brain farted and didn't know. So yeah, those are those things that I struggle with when I make a rule and then I immediately break it and I forgot I made the rule, and like I have these discrepancies that I have to figure out whether it's going to be a big rewrite or can I write my way out, can I Hamilton it and figure out a way that, usually it's with magic systems, but it could be world building things too. Like I had to figure out in Earthsinger Chronicles, the country of Lagrimar is a desert and it's surrounded by mountains. And the only way they can get to the other countries is the Breach Valley, where they have this one little valley in this break in the mountains where they have the wars. But they have trade from the country to the east. And at a certain point is like, how do they do that? Oh, well, at some point they drilled through the mountains and people can't go through it. Like I had to create rules for that. And because it was a thing like, how do they get anything? They can't make everything in this desert land. I already established that they don't have a lot of resources. That's why they go to war all the time. But they do have trade. And so I had to just write out the history of the creation of this trade path, why people can't escape or come in that way, and make a new set of rules for that. So that's what I struggle with. What are your top 3 writing reference books besides Save the Cat? Besides Save the Cat, I would definitely say that K.M. Weiland is an author that has a bunch of books. She also has a website called helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com, I believe. But Creating Character Arcs by K.M. Weiland, this one is definitely a top book. She has Creating Character Arcs. There's an outlining your novel and structuring your novel. This is the one, if I'm only going to get one, I would get this one. But structuring your novel is also really good. So I would say this one, Write Your Novel from the Middle by James Scott Bell. And probably The Story Grid by Sean Coyne. Story Grid is more of like an intermediate. So if you're a beginning writer, I wouldn't necessarily jump right there. But if you've been writing for a little while, then the Story Grid is really helpful. And like only use what you want to use. Like Story Grid gets into some places that I can't. They have these charts. I love charts. It's too many charts. Those charts are too much. So with any craft book, like I don't use everything in any of them. I pick and choose the things that make sense to me and that help me in the moment. And yeah, that would be my advice too, especially with craft books, because if you try to do everything they say, which I have tried to do, I was like, I'm going to do this whole thing, I'm going to do this entire process from beginning to end, and that's how I'm going to write my book. And it just never worked. It's just like you'll be going along for a while, and then if you're trying to fit your story into their system, a lot of times maybe you can do that, but it won't feel natural and it won't feel right. So that's kind of why I like having a lot of craft books, and I will use, pieces of this and pieces of that. And then when it starts feeling wrong, I'll switch to another one and see if there's anything I can glean from that to make the process a little easier. Because if I try to follow one to the T, it stifles creativity and it just ends up feeling stilted and like you're putting, round pegs into square holes or whatever. You do have to allow like the muse and the magic of writing to happen a little bit while you're structuring and plotting and world building and all of that too. We've been lucky. My dog is here and he hasn't barked at all. Like, hopefully I'm not going to jinx him, but okay. I have a few minutes left. If there's any final questions, let me know in the chat. And if I was going to wrap up, I would just reiterate to don't spend all of your time world building. Make sure that you are writing. Is it worth getting a hard copy of the story grid? Yes, absolutely. I think so. I look at it a lot. It's got the chart inside, which so story grid has a method of genres that is unique to it. So it's not necessarily the Amazon genres, but I think it is worth understanding and looking through. And I often look at the chart and then also sort of the descriptions of the genres. I like having hard copies of craft books just so I can like highlight them and mark them up. I've got tabs and things in all of them. And you can, if you do that on a Kindle or on an iPad or whatever, just as easily, that's fine. But for me, flipping through is really helpful with craft stuff. There are a couple of times I have just gotten a craft book on digital, like an ebook, and it just feels different. I like to have the tactile and take notes and stuff. So yeah. How do you approach short stories versus novels? Short stories come a little bit more naturally because I don't have to worry about quite as many things. So I really streamline everything. I did a short story for an anthology recently, a short fairy story that, like I only dealt with the things that were directly related to the character and the story. So I didn't worry too much about a lot of the world building. And it was a fairy. And I was like, okay, well, she's exiled from the fairyland, which I call elsewhere. And, that's kind of all I knew. Like maybe she had a family there, maybe she didn't, but she's stuck here. She can't go back. So it's a much more streamlined process for short stories because there's not the depth of the world, and it's not going to be a series most likely. Although I'm thinking of doing a series of the fairy stories, and I might have to retcon some stuff because I didn't think about it in as much detail as I usually do. But I think it's totally fine. Like put your energy where it needs to go. I didn't need to spend all of my energy building the detailed world for a 5,000 word story, So that is what I would say. And then you can build on it. If your short story becomes a novel later, or you expand the world and have a series, then deal with the things that you don't know then. And if you have inconsistencies, either deal with them or retcon them, or try to write your way out of them and try to figure out why this was an exception to the rule, but now the rule is really this thing over here. And I think people will generally forgive you for that. So I think we are out of time. Thank you guys so much for coming and listening. I have a podcast called My Imaginary Friends, where I talk every week about what happened in my writing week and how the problems I'm going through, my ups and downs, how I'm trying to figure things out. So feel free to listen to that on your favorite podcast application. And Requiem of Silence comes out August 17th. So that's the final book in the Earthsinger Chronicles, if you have been reading along. I'm doing a read along on Instagram for people who are just getting into the series too. So any of those things are cool. And you can find me at lpenelope.com if you would like more information about me or my books. So thanks so much for being with me, and hope that you enjoy the rest of your Virtuous Con.